Tom, it is fantastic having you on. I'm really, really excited, very privileged. I've enjoyed reading your work. I've kind of followed you from afar on Twitter. I don't go on Twitter nearly enough. You know, you need an Instagram. Instagram is where it's at. I don't know if you have it. Do you? You're a
I do, but
photographer,
I'm
right?
not on it enough. I am a photographer.
Yeah, you need to get on Instagram, man, and be on it.
I do occasionally, maybe once or twice a week, but
it's just a better world. Twitter and Facebook, I just find is this like hodgepodge of people arguing. But no, I have enjoyed when I have logged onto Twitter. Occasionally, I'll see a tweet from you and go, "Oh, that's great." But I've loved your book, specifically God Can't, which is a fantastic title. Just the title, right? It's a bit like, you remember when Rob Bell brought out his book Love Wins, and before it even came out, people were like, this guy's out, get him out. You bring out a book called God Can't, and you're going to have John Piper going, right, farewell, Oord. I don't know what rhymes with Oord, but
yeah, good question.
Yeah. Anyway, why don't you give yourself a bit of an introduction, let people know who you are, a little bit about your background, and we can dive in there. I'm sure we'll kind of bounce around all over the place, but it'll give us a bit of a springboard to go from.
Sure. I grew up in a fairly traditional Christian home, fairly good parents in a little farming community in the northwest part of the United States. And church was a really important part of my life, my family's life. I like to say I accepted Jesus into my heart multiple times as a kid. And by the time I was in high school and college, I was taking Christianity very seriously. I was one of these people who did a lot of evangelism, door-to-door witnessing on planes, at the beach, etc. I took it pretty seriously by the time I was in my early 20s. Yeah. And then I took a philosophy of religion course my last year in college. It happened to be, I was preparing for ministry. I planned to be in some kind of service. I didn't know exactly what, but I took this course, and for the first time in my life, I read writings from atheists, agnostics, people from other religious traditions. And although I'd had plenty of conversations with folks, you know, who had those kind of leanings, none of them were really as smart as the people I was reading. And you know, when you're a gung-ho evangelist, you're an evangelical who's trying to change the world. You know, you've got all your little answers. You've studied the Bible, and you can point to your proof text and say, you know, well, here, you got a question. Here's the right answer. Just turn your Bible to this passage or whatever. So, you know, I was pretty good at that. But these guys were and almost all were guys. I can't think of any girls, but most of them were guys. They were as smart or smarter than me. And it really,
even at your last year in college?
I know. Can
it's
you
amazing,
believe
isn't it, when we find these people, you know?
And so it really was for the sake of intellectual honesty that I stopped believing in God.
Wow.
I'll never forget coming to pick up my fiance, who's now my wife, her getting in the car and me turning to her and saying, you know what, I just can't believe in God anymore.
Wow.
And she was also a religion major, so we were both preparing for ministry. And here I was saying, you know, I can't do this.
That's
and
wild.
You know, some people, I don't know about you, but I've encountered atheists who turn to, or agnostics, who reject the faith they've been given for various reasons. You know, some of them maybe are just rebelling against the status quo. Maybe some of them, you know, want to shed off these moral constraints and sort of live a freer life. Or, you know, maybe they've been abused by pastors or family, and they say, no way, I'm going to believe in a God that, you know, this person endorses. For me, it was none of that. For me, it was really intellectual. It was like, okay, the reasons I think there's a God, now I've got some really good arguments against that. What should I do? Well, I guess for sake of honesty, I need to give up those reasons.
Wow. So what did that, was that quite a, I mean, because, you know, you do that course in college, it's, how long is that? Like 3 months, 4 months, probably?
Not even that long in this college. Right? Yeah. It was a couple of months.
So, I mean, maybe. that's a small window to be like going gung ho, going for it, and then going like, whoa, this has hit me, like took me for like, you know, 6 here, like what's happened?
Yes.
To then go, so was this you're reading their arguments and you're going, well, I guess I'm just wrong, like screw it? Or were you going, wait, hold on, there's gotta be a right answer, I just maybe don't know it? Or how did you process? Because intellectually, like, I know for me, I engage with most things quite intellectually. I'm not the most emotive driven person, but I know for me, I would always be going, well, there's got to be an answer to back up my belief. I'm very rooted in what I like to believe.
Sure, yeah. It wasn't just like an
that?
overnight thing. I mean, it was also the case that as an evangelist, I really wasn't seeing the kind of results I thought I ought to see. You know, like, yeah, I could argue most people under the bus, but they really didn't seem to change their lives very radically. And those who said yes to Jesus, you know, they didn't seem to mature very quickly. And so there had to be more to it than what I was doing. So I was kind of open to the possibility that I could be wrong about some things.
Sure.
And the other thing is that I really kept at it. Like, you know, I didn't say, oh, there's an argument I haven't heard before. That undermines what I believe. Well, you know, I think I'm going to become a plumber now. You know, I just sort of, I kept thinking about it. I kept wrestling with it. And really it was two things that brought me back to thinking it was more plausible than not that there was a God. One was I had this sense that there needed to be something like ultimate meaning in life. And I couldn't make sense of meaning beyond just my personal preference or the preference of my group or whatever, but something ultimate, if there wasn't an ultimate ground for meaning that most people call God. So that was one. It was the quest for meaning. The second one is I had these deep intuitions that I ought to be a loving person and that other people ought to be loving. That in some sense, you know, it is true that love is the answer. And I couldn't make good sense intellectually of those intuitions if there wasn't some kind of a source for those intuitions about love. And that source is what a lot of people, I think, want to call God. So I remember, you know, just saying, okay, well, I don't know there's a God. I still don't know there's a God. I'm not certain there's a God. But I remember thinking, it seems more likely, if these things are going to make sense, that there has to be something like a God. And I graduated from college, went and interviewed to become an associate pastor at some churches. And basically my theology was, there is a loving God. Jesus is pretty cool. And that's about it.
Yeah. Did you put that on your resume?
I actually lost a job at an interview. I had a pastor ask me, you know, what do you think about Jesus? And I was honest, and he was like, okay, well, that ain't enough, you know?
Yeah, which you can understand, right? I mean, you're running a kind of like mainline conventional Christian church, and the guy's like, yeah, he's a decent guy. I'm not sure beyond that.
Kind of, you know, asked the question, what's Jesus' atoning sacrifice for? And I'm like, got me. I mean, I don't believe in a God who wants to kill his son. So
I had a friend who went through, I think it was either 3 or 4 rounds of interviews to become like a associate pastor, or I can't remember, it was maybe a worship pastor or something. It's pretty involved in a big church, and he went through multiple rounds. They liked him, like they were like, we really want you. On the last interview, they asked him what he believed about tithing, I think, and he was like, well, he's like, obviously, like, it's not like mandated like your kind of prosperity gospel people would think. I do tithe, but like, I'm not going to tell people like the Bible says you have to tithe. I just don't think that does that. Never called him back. Just overnight, we're just like, all right, well, you can leave then, and just didn't talk. I'm like, so like, if that's the sort of thing that some Christians are like, well, we have to draw a line and now stand somewhere. When you go in going, well, the thing about Jesus, I don't know what the cross really means. Like, I mean, I know that this stuff. Yeah. Oh man, that's a biggie. How did your wife cope with that? Right, because that's a big thing for people that go through these journeys. It's hard enough to do that on your own when you're. I know you're saying you're engaged at this point, right? Not married, right? But even still, you're kind of pretty tied in. You're committed to each other. She's passionately pursuing some sort of religious kind of career path. And the person she wants to spend the rest of her life with turns around and goes, that's a terrifying moment, I'd imagine.
Yeah, it's been a wild ride for her. I mean, throughout our dating and marriage life, because I mean, not only did she stick with me despite my doubts about what I believed,
Mm,
um, I've always been the one who is probably more intellectually engaged in wrestling with these questions. And so I would periodically, come up and tell her something like, I don't believe in a literal hell. And she would say, well, like she hasn't moved through the steps
yeah.
intellectually to get there.
You've
It's not
just
like she
chucked
was
her off the
going to,
deep end.
yeah, not like she was going to argue for a hell, but she just wasn't moving through the
Yeah.
learning process. And same with it comes to graduate school and PhD. It's just she went down an education path as a public school teacher, and she
Mm,
had different things she was concerned about. So
yeah.
yeah, my wife's been pretty amazing to stick with me through all of
Yeah, it
this.
sounds it. Yeah. No, I mean, that's one of the things I'm doing every day is talking to dozens of people, helping them through their journeys. And frequently, I mean, more frequently than not, couples don't do this at the same pace.
Right.
And if they
Oh
are at the
yeah.
same pace, they're usually starting at different points. So even
Yeah.
then, it's hard to navigate, and it can be a real make or break thing. It can be really complex, and I think different people are very different. My wife is very different to me. She's quite intellectual. She's got a degree in philosophy. She loves that stuff. She doesn't love it that much, though. She's like, I'm not going to spend my spare time sitting mulling over the
Yeah.
meaning of the universe. She's like, I'll watch some TV or I'll hang out with friends. Or I'm like, maybe we can solve like the problem of evil if I just stare at this blank wall and think for another 28 minutes.
I
But I'll do
love
the
it.
same thing. I remember one of our first dates. She asked me, she said, I heard you got some like heretical views. Like, what are some of them? And I was like, well, one of them is I don't believe that hell is a place you go to eternally, consciously be tormented forever. And she had like an existential crisis on the spot, and I was like,
Yeah. Yeah.
oh, I guess that's how people that aren't on the journey respond to this. This is very
Right.
early on in
Right.
my process of navigating a lot of this as well. So that is amazing that your wife managed to navigate and walk with you through that.
It
So
is. Yeah.
what happened next after that then? So you go through this kind of like tailspin of like, I'm not really sure what's going on, to, well, I'm kind of sure as I can be, that there's some kind of fundamentals here that point towards a God. And I think Jesus is heavily linked into this. You're not doing so well on the interview stage because of these
Well,
solid positions you take.
I ended up getting a job as a youth pastor in a little farming community, and I was there for 4 years. My senior pastor was a really good guy, but not deep intellectually. He
Right.
will
Okay.
admit that very quickly. And this was, before the internet. So it wasn't like I had a community of people to be wrestling with these things
Yeah.
through. I started reading a lot of books. I mean, I already had read a ton, but I was doing that more. I found a local youth pastor who was also, even though he's from a very different theological perspective, he was also wrestling with big questions. And so we started what we called the Dead Theologians Society. And we
Nice.
would meet every few months and argue about theology. But during that time as a youth pastor, I realized there were lots of other people who were wrestling with these big questions, even some in high school who were particularly bright. And I thought, I think I want to go and be in a context in which I'm dealing with, you know, young 20 somethings or 20 somethings, people who are wrestling with these big questions at this prime
Yeah.
time in their life. And so I should go get a degree and see if I could become a professor. And so after 4 years of full-time ministry, I went and did a master's of divinity and then a master's of art and religion, and then did my PhD. And so it took about, let's see, that was from about 8 years,
Wow.
from 92 to 99, 7 years. Yeah.
Wow.
To do those things. And then I started teaching philosophy and theology in near the Boston area, and eventually took a job in Idaho where I taught mostly theology, occasionally some philosophy. But
Right. Wow. What was your doctorate in?
well, the degree is theology and philosophy of religion. So my particular focus really gets to kind of the point of God can't. My particular focus is I wanted to have what we would say in philosophy is a metaphysics, a worldview, an overall framework to try to make sense of my big questions, including the questions of evil, but questions of science and religion, questions of revelation, all that sort of stuff. And so I was attracted to what I now call open and relational theology. And that has a particular view of God's relation to the universe that I found particularly helpful.
Awesome. Well, why don't you expand on that? Because I feel like that's where we want to spend a lot of time today.
Sounds good.
I like to have my guests stay in their area of expertise as well, so I'm really bad for asking people their opinion on all sorts of different things. So feel free to go, Phil, I don't know. That's not what I'm focused on. So let's make sure we're trying to at least as much of the time focus on your area of expertise.
Well, one of my problems, Phil, is that I have so many different interests, and I just go this way and that, and do papers and write books on all kinds of topics. So
perfect.
Yeah.
Well, you're suited for this podcast then, because that's why it goes everywhere. I'm interested in absolutely everything and anything.
Good.
Great. But yes.
Well, let me start with open and relational theology, and then maybe we can work from there. It surprises a lot of people when they discover that most of the major Christian and Muslim theologians in history have believed that God doesn't care a whit about what happens on the earth. And I mean by care, is not affected by in any way whatsoever. The classic language is God is impassible. That means that God, whatever we do, doesn't affect God in any sense whatsoever. God doesn't receive. God isn't influenced by the world. I believe God is influenced, and I use the word relational to talk about that. So, you list your major theologians in Christian history: Aquinas, Luther, Calvin, Augustine. None of them thought that our prayers actually had an influence on God. None of them thought that God could truly be compassionate in the sense of having what happened in the world have an effect on God's emotions.
Yeah.
Relational theologians think, God really does have something like emotions. God really is affected. Our prayers can make a difference. It really fits nicely with what I think is a general thrust of the Bible, even though I don't want to claim the Bible is like a systematic theology, but I think it fits nicely with a general view of a God who is engaging moment by moment, giving and receiving with the world. So that's the relational part of open and relational.
Yeah.
The open part is going to sound more controversial, but I suspect that it's actually might be more intuitive than your listeners might initially think. The open view says that the future is really the future for us and for God. In other words, instead of thinking of God as outside of time and seeing all of history in one now, so that the past and the present are the same for God, this view says that there's really a past for God, really a present for God, and the future is something God can't know with absolute certainty because it hasn't yet happened yet. So the future is open for God and for us. Yeah. Another way to say it is that God experiences time moment by moment, sequentially, like we do. And that's also not been the view of God's relation to time by people like Augustine, Calvin, Luther, all those folks.
Yeah.
So openness theologians or open and relational theologians take really seriously the idea that God moves through time analogously to how we move through time.
Yeah. I feel like, so I have a small introduction on one of my websites where I do free videos for kind of introducing different topics. And I have a section on open theism. So
great. So I didn't know that.
I'm aware of it, and maybe some of my listeners might have got around to listen to it. I don't know if they have or not. So some will be like, oh yeah, okay, yeah, I've heard that before. Others are going to be like, who is this guy? Let's burn him. And then others are going to go, that's why I'm here. I want to hear something crazy. But so that is, it feels extremely out of left field for most Christians. I mean, it's really wild. Whereas the relational element, I feel that there's probably been more and more of an evolution of that being more normative in modern Christianity. Is that a fair assumption? Just in that we've shifted from more of a communal top-down God that just does things on the whole, as opposed to like a more personal, relational Jesus,
Yes.
that kind of
Yeah.
concept. So is that side of what you are looking at when you're talking about this open relational theology? Is that probably the side that's more welcome, or do you feel that's more welcomed by people than the element of the
Yes,
open kind of
I
theistic
think
kind of
that's a
concept?
great way to put it. And then oftentimes for people who see the wisdom, I'll say, in the relational view, I'll say, well, now, if God is relational and is in giving and receiving,
Mm,
doesn't that kind of presuppose there's one moment God gave and the next moment God received?
yeah.
And that sounds like God is time full or moment by moment. There's some kind
Yeah.
of a sequence in God's experience. And so the relational, it doesn't always lead people to accept the openness. But once they see the implications of the relational, they then see how it could be possible that God is moving through time like we are.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm always struck by this. I remember as a teenager reading the Bible and just reading these kind of like bizarre emotions that God has, and thinking, that's a weird emotion for God to have. Like it's very anthropomorphized in a sense, and maybe that is what the writers are doing. They're projecting themselves onto a being that is beyond any of that. But if we are to go, no, maybe this is accurate. Maybe this Bible is reflecting clearly what God's like. It's weird that God can be surprised. It's like,
Yeah.
huh, that's a weird one to put in there. Or it's weird that
Yeah.
God can regret something. Can you regret something
Yes.
when you know it's going to go a certain way?
I don't
And so
think
I
so, at
remember
least not
kind of wrestling
genuinely.
with that as a kid, but like not as a kid, maybe more late teens, but going, but I don't have any outs.
Yes.
There's there wasn't an option for me to go, oh, maybe he doesn't know the future. Like that just wasn't on the cards. Like, when you're
Yeah.
a good evangelical Christian, that's not like, right, Phil, here's your 4 options, it maybe would be like, Calvinism versus Arminianism would be like your
Right.
broad, this is the options, either God knows the future and predestines you to do this, and he's an asshole, or God knows the future but lets you do it, but at some point he made you the way you are, and therefore he made you in a way that you would do that, and he's an asshole. Like, I was like, it's still like there's no way of me getting out of God being an asshole here. He's really not a great person.
Yep.
And I remember having these arguments with my pastors, and they're like, I don't understand, like, obviously this is better than that because of this, but they fail to see that on some level, to me, and this has always been my attraction to open theism when I came across it. I think I came across it through Greg Boyd, probably. I know he's a big guy for this topic in a lot of people's worlds. But I constantly was going, I just can't see the difference between these views of being predestined and free will, that is as soon as you have a requirement that God knows the future, he's not a very good person. To me. And so that's really fascinating. So do you want to go into, we can go into relational stuff more, but I'm like, this open world is just like, it's such a playground of like, what ifs, in my sense. This is
Yes.
my inner
Yes.
philosopher loves this part. You get to put down in the
Yeah.
Bible with the extreme theologies and go, yeah, well, let's look at that and allow that to play in. But what if we just play in this philosophical, metaphysical kind of playground? God not knowing the future. I mean, that's a radical position. Is that a position that was played with early in the faith at any point, or is this a very modern kind of concept?
Well, the typical story an open theist would tell is that the Bible points to an open view of God because of some of the things you've mentioned: a God who repents, has regrets, makes plans, does covenants, all that sort of thing. But the story an open theist would usually tell is that because of Aristotle and then Neoplatonic philosophy's influence on Augustine, Thomas Aquinas, and many others, a kind of Greek philosophical metaphysics or philosophy began to inform or shape the way theology was played out. And, there might be some other factors that are involved here, like the rise of politics and power. And, you could tell the story in different kinds of ways. But the open theist would want to say, look, if you just have the biblical text as your primary resource, it should lead you to something like an open view. And the problem has been these, not that philosophy is bad, but some philosophies are going to be better than others. And this
Mm.
particular philosophy hasn't been helpful in portraying the God, at least the majority of scripture seems to describe.
Sure. Is there any evidence in any kind of early Judaism or anything like that? Because from my understanding of like kind of looking through like the Talmud and like, you know, Midrash kind of exploration of the scriptures and looking at it from different, I've not particularly come across that, but I am not well versed in the Old Testament or early
Yeah, it's
Judaism.
less common in Judaism, although
Hmm.
Maimonides was very much influenced by
Okay.
Neoplatonic philosophy. So you can find major Jewish thinkers, philosophers, who also thought God was probably timeless. But generally speaking, because the Jewish tradition, Judaism has focused so much upon the scriptures and wrestling with those, it's a lot of Jewish theologians and philosophers are open theists.
Okay.
Perhaps maybe the most influential 20th century Jewish scholar, Abraham Joshua Heschel,
Yeah.
definitely an open theist.
Wow. Fascinating. That's really interesting. Yeah. Because I often wonder when I read certain, I just read his book on the Sabbath, tiny little book. It's really great. But I often wonder when I'm reading certain people, I'm like, they could maybe be an open theist, but I feel like I'm wishing people into my camp, if that makes sense. You know, you're like, oh yeah, they're on
Yeah,
my side. You're right. We all want to do that,
yeah,
don't we? Especially if they're one of the biggies. You know, like you get
that's
Heschel on your
right.
sides. I mean, like who's going to argue?
Well,
Um,
because open theism is so controversial, a lot of people really did hide
yeah,
their affinities. I mean, I don't know how big this guy is over in the UK, but here in the States, um, Dallas Willard, do you know that
yeah,
name?
yeah,
Dallas Willard, open theist,
yeah,
but a closeted one. I
yeah.
even asked him personally about it. And he didn't want to talk to me. So
Wow.
there's certain political implications if people like Dallas Willard came out as an open theist.
Sure. Well, I mean, it's probably no, it's more extreme. It's up there though. As you going into your interview and going, I don't know what I believe about Jesus. You know, if you're a big professor or whatever, I mean, you know, you're a theologian at a seminary or something right now, aren't you? Yeah. No. So if that, I don't know what affiliation that is or what it looks like, but you know, if I'm assuming it's fairly chill with you writing these books. So, but you know, if you're part of, I don't know. Some very very conservative kind of conventional camp, and you're not likely to get away with something like going, I don't know if God knows what's going to happen next. Like that's a huge statement for, you know, a huge portion of Christians.
I'm really happy you're saying this, Phil, because this means that you've not spent a lot of time on the internet looking me up, because I lost my job 5 years ago.
Oh
And
wow. Okay, sorry. This is great. This is wonderful. Not at the time, I'm sure.
no, not at the time at all, and
Oh
still
wow.
painful.
I bet.
But
I bet.
and while me losing my job, open theism wasn't explicitly said as the reason.
Right.
The reason was given was a dip in enrollment. It was really one of the reasons. It was theological kinds of
Yeah.
things. I had to go through a trial, a heresy trial. I made it through that trial. That's why they had to come up with some other reason to let me go.
Right.
But yeah, these are
Wow.
big issues that people, especially who want a particular kind of theology, I'll just say a conservative theology, that's general, but I'll just say
No,
a
yeah.
conservative theology, it gets them pretty angry to
Yeah.
find out there's an alternative.
Yeah, this is so. This might be a complete side detour, but let's go on this one.
Yeah. Okay.
This is something fascinating. I just had a friend of mine who's doing a doctorate at King's College, and we were talking about the dynamic of the academy versus kind of the church. I use church more as a statement of the institution than the body of Christ.
Okay.
But when we look at the academy, maybe where it is out of the chains or the limitations of the church, you will find these extraordinary diversities of beliefs and ideologies and concepts. You know, look at like a very secular university that's very well regarded. It's got some of the smartest theologians in the world on their things. They could basically say whatever the heck they want about some sort of theological
Right.
principle, because it's the institution that they're part of isn't this church institution that has a very specific set of beliefs and principles. And there is this element where there's almost like a conflict of interest when we look at certain theological seminaries, colleges, whatever labels they have. and I know that can be a big gray area anyway, what these kind of labels mean. It feels that a lot of academics have their hands tied when they're in an institution that does have a statement of faith sort of thing behind it on some level. You know, if you're teaching in a Baptist seminary, you're not going to get away with a lot of things, right? Because the Baptists believe the Baptist stuff. And so when they're bringing their students in, yeah, of course. And I'm speaking from Europe, where Baptist means basically anything. It doesn't really matter. My dad was a Baptist; he was a Pentecostal. You know, so in Europe it's very different. But I know in America it becomes a bit less. And then if you go into a certain subset, maybe a Southern Baptist, or like you're like, okay, well that means that. So you go into a Southern Baptist college as a student, you know you're coming out as a Southern Baptist with a very set of beliefs. And if you don't come out that way, you're going to find it really hard to get a job as a Southern Baptist pastor. Do you have thoughts on, because I know a lot of people that listen want to go into some levels of study and areas of study and stuff. Would you recommend people try and avoid institutions that are tethered to kind of like specific beliefs or ideas?
Not necessarily. It is a very complex set of issues. You know, in the States, we call it the question of academic freedom. You know, how much freedom do you have to pursue the questions and topics you think are important? And in a quote, secular or state kind of university, or at least a private college that doesn't have any particular theological affinities or commitments, you know, that range of theological freedom or academic freedom is much wider. But if you end up deciding you're going to be, to use your illustration, at a Baptist school, the Baptist school has certain commitments in the Baptist tradition. And while they're going to allow for a range of diversity, that range is going to depend upon how one interprets what the core ideas are in that tradition. So in my particular case, you know, I'm a part of a Wesleyan theological tradition, and it has a certain range, a certain umbrella. My ideas, I think, fit under that umbrella, and so do the majority of scholars in that tradition. But the scholars in a liberal arts Christian school, private school in the States, they don't really have a lot of power. You know, it's the donors, it's the major pastors who are sending their students to this institution. They're the ones who've got most of the power. And so if they think you're outside the umbrella, even though you're not outside it according to what other scholars say, well, you know, you've got a real difficult time on your hands. So I think as a scholar, you know, let's say I'm a Baptist, and I start thinking and believing things that really don't fit with the core of the Baptist tradition. Well, I think you probably ought to look for another job. Or if you're the kind of person who can just keep it all inside and teach something you don't believe, which a lot of scholars do, you could do that route. For me, I always felt like I was still a part of the tradition, maybe not, you know, the conservative part of that tradition, but still a part of the tradition. But others with more power had other ideas.
So did you not necessarily see this coming when you were kind of looking at some of the ideas you're looking at? You weren't going, oh, this is really close to the line. I might not, this might not go well. Or was that something you had to juggle and wrestle with and go, oh, do I want to talk about this? Do I want to explore this publicly? Maybe this is me time stuff, you know, maybe this is when I go home. You don't have to talk about this either if this is kind of,
I don't mind at all.
An area that's
I don't mind.
Probably not.
So what a lot of scholars do is once they get their first position, they've got their PhD or whatever doctoral degree they have, they'll make a couple of choices. Well, at least one big choice. Am I going to focus my writing on the academy and who's going to read it there? Am I going to focus it on the church or the public? And usually the church and the public are intertwined, but they can be separated. And many people it's an either or choice. I decided I was going to do both.
Right.
Now that makes me particularly vulnerable because stuff that I write for the academy that questions the virgin birth, let's say,
Sure.
can filter down into the local church. And there can be some pastors who think the virgin birth is an essential part of the Christian tradition that are going to get angry. Likewise, sometimes you write things really plainly for the person in the pew, and you're worried that your academic colleagues are going to say, oh, that's just fluff, so you don't have the kind of prestige. But I decided I was going to go both directions. And so for many years, I would write one book for the church and the next one for the academy. Church, academy, go back and forth. And I decided I was going to put my controversial ideas on blogs and say them on podcasts. And, I was going to be out there. And that, in many ways, put a target on my chest.
Yeah.
But the upside is I felt like I could help a lot of people.
Yeah. Huge amount.
So there's pros and cons to that strategy.
It feels, I was talking about this with Jared, the guy I was mentioning earlier, like it feels that there aren't a huge amount of people that do both. That there are, obviously,
Very
when you look at the grand spec, you stand back and look at all humanity, there's probably several thousands. But, when you're actually sitting there looking at the Christian bestseller list and you're going, right, I want someone that is doing hard graft. I want someone that has dedicated 8 years to this one topic and written something with, more footnotes than most of these books, and I want them to rewrite it all for an idiot like me. That's a really rare group. You've got certain rare people that are doing it really well, but they are few and far between.
That's right. It's hard. It's very hard.
Yeah.
You would think that, we all grow up, how should I say this? We all grow up without PhDs, right? So you would think that once you got a PhD and you learn that lingo, it would be really easy just sort of drift back into the way you talked before you got a PhD. But it is not easy.
Yeah.
Because, you get your doctoral degree, you've given your life to these complex ideas, and the words associated with ideas mean so much to you. You don't want to give up.
Yep.
And so you want to use, some $20,000 word in this article you're writing to your grandmother, and it just doesn't work.
No.
So
it's
hard.
Really interesting. Who do you think are some of the best kind of scholars out there that are doing this?
Wow, that's a good question.
Obviously, aside from yourself, who's number 2, 3,
It's interesting. Take someone like Greg Boyd. Greg has a PhD and he does a lot of research, but he can also write for the common person. One of Greg's difficulties is that because he's a pastor, he doesn't get to engage in as much with voices in the academy.
Sure.
I'm not saying he would be a good person, I think, who does both. N.T. Wright can do it, although I think Tom could work harder on being more accessible. But he does a good job, I think.
Yeah.
He writes for both.
I get recommended N.T. all the time, and I've got to admit, I've read a couple of his books, and I thought they were average.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. But I was like, I don't understand why so many people are telling me I have to read this. Like, and I don't know if it's just I'm just not in that space. I'm not interested in what he's writing about. I mean, it's mostly stuff that I'm fairly interested in. But yeah, I've never got it. But he's one of the first names that often comes up, and it's certainly that's still very accessible in a lot of the evangelical world, even like.
That's right.
But still pushing a lot of people into scholarly topics that most evangelicals won't even consider.
Right. That's what makes him interesting, because it kind of depends on who the audience is. If you have a conservative evangelical background, you might think Tom Wright's kind of progressive. But if you're coming from a mainline progressive background, you think, well, Tom Wright, well, what's the big deal about this guy? I thought I was told this in Sunday school, that heaven can be on earth, or whatever. So anyway, it kind of depends on your background.
That's interesting. Yeah, no, I'm constantly fascinated by this. If you think of any others, just shout them out at some point.
Okay.
But because I think one of the things that strikes me as fascinating, so we look at something maybe like open theism, like open theism's kind of exploded onto the scene I've been in the world of kind of like studying this stuff and kind of conveying it to a more general audience that aren't academic. And I'm not academic. I've got a regular undergraduate degree in computing, but I just like to study, and I'm really, really not very smart, and I don't read fast. So I open up these academic things, and I'm like, I have no idea what the hell this is saying. I'm gonna have to work hard to figure this out. So I think it makes me being able to write something for the average person really easy, because I'm going, oh, I spent a month reading this one paper trying to figure it out. I can definitely explain it to you as an idiot, because I'm clearly an idiot here. And so, it's like, if you can get the kids to understand quantum mechanics, the kid is going to explain it to everyone fantastically. But one thing I've noticed is that these kind of topics, some of these topics are often decades from really filtering into the institutional church, the average Christian's life. And to me, something like open theism, it feels like it was barely talked about at all. And now it's I don't think it's popular yet, but it seems like it's much more, there's much more on there. You go into Google Scholar and type in open theism or any of the kind of buzzwords associated with that, you'll find dozens and dozens of papers on it, and some. And I think that generally the format has been, people don't typically write for the layperson. They have written scholarly. It filters down over like 50 years or something through a pastor that eventually kind of tiptoes a bit, and bit by bit it makes it into the real world. Do you see open theism following that format, or do you think that people like yourself, Greg, that have written about these kind of topics, do you see that kind of speeding up that process? Like, or are you observing that on the whole?
Yeah, I think the process is, I don't know how fast it's going. I don't know how to gauge that.
Sure. I'm just throwing out dates as well. I mean, I don't know if it's 50 years or whatever, but yeah.
Yeah. But books like, you mentioned earlier, my book, God Can't, that's really written for a person who doesn't have any background in theology and philosophy, who just, maybe they've grown up in the church or around the church, or they have relatives who are believers, and they've asked those hard questions and they've been dissatisfied with the usual answers. A book like God Can't, even though I don't think I ever used the phrase open theism in that whole book.
No, I didn't see it once when I read it.
Yeah.
I remember literally thinking at the end, I was like, this feels like he's saying a lot of things that are to do with open theism. He didn't mention it. Like, I wonder if is he not? So I remember actually thinking when you first kind of wrote it.
What's funny, Phil, is I wrote a book called The Uncontrolling Love of God in 2015.
Okay.
I think it's pretty readable, but it was published by an academic press.
Okay.
And it, got lots of great reviews, sold super well. People do dissertations on it. I'm very, very happy with that book. But many people who read it said, this is just too academic. I want something I can give my mother to read. And so I wrote God Can't. Well, the strange thing about God Can't is that I have been invited to speak in literally dozens of graduate schools and seminaries. People who I thought would have wanted The Uncontrolling Love of God because it was more academic, but they're having their graduate students read God Can't. So I've asked a few of them, and I've got the same answer. The answer is this: we know that our students, most of them are going to be pastors, and they can't use the language that we're teaching here. So your book translates those big ideas of open theism in ways that people can understand. And so we want our graduate students to read your book.
Yeah.
That's I think
huge dynamic. And that is, I think, what translates it into the day-to-day person's life, isn't it? I mean, it's the pastor often is the middle ground where they go into these scholarly worlds and study, and then they go into the real world and go, this person's husband's dying on on a hospital bed. I don't think they care if I call it open theism or blah, blah, blah. It doesn't make any difference to them. They just want to be loved. They want to be comforted. And I need some language for that. And I think, that's incredible.
And I think not only do they want to be loved and comforted, to use your particular illustration, at least when they're removed somewhat from the situation, they want some kind of an answer that makes sense to them. I mean, I think we've sometimes not given the average person in the pew enough intellectual credit, that they're asking bigger and deeper questions. Now, maybe what blocks them from the kind of answers scholars want to give is the technical phrases and the terminology. But So many times I've heard on the problem of evil, look, you don't give people answers, you just suffer with them. And I'm
Mm,
like, does it have to be an either or? I
yeah.
mean, can we suffer with them and provide a plausible answer to what God must have been up to or not up to? So, yeah.
That's really interesting. Yeah. So let's go into that topic, right? So you've got, you have this person, their partner's dying, and they go, how can this be? How can this, how could there even be a God? Maybe it's a small kid dying, or, I mean, like this, of course there's a tier of people that die where we're like, of course that
There
could
is.
be. And then there's
You're
like,
right.
well, hold on, this is just not okay.
Yeah.
Obviously it's like, someone's dog dying is like obviously the worst of all of them, but we have these tiers, don't we? And it's like, yeah, grandpa wasn't that nice a guy. I mean, like, these things happen.
Well, even if he was a nice guy, you say, a 95-year-old, they had a good run.
Yeah.
A 5-year-old, you're going like, come on, the whole life was ahead of them.
Tough one to kind of answer. So
Yeah.
what would you say to someone that's the 5-year-old's dying, and we'll take the emotional side and put that to the side. So I'm not going to require you to pass to them as you do it, but how would you intellectually kind of present, well, what's going on here? Why is God allowing this, or God not allowing, or unable, like your concepts of God? Like how do you go into that topic and kind of explore that topic with someone?
Well, maybe I ought to begin with why I don't like the traditional answers. So like some people will say to that person, look, God just needed another angel in heaven. Well, that's a really poor answer. That you don't hear that as much. Yeah.
For a guy that creates angels, I mean.
Yeah. A more plausible answer is something like, God could see that little Jimmy was going to do some bad things in the future, and therefore God killed him off early or allowed him to die early. Now, I don't think that's a good answer, but if you think God knows the future, then you might think that's plausible, that God could see that Jimmy living into the future and was going to become a pimp and a rapist or whatever.
Yeah.
I don't think that's a good answer, but it's better than God needed another angel.
Yeah. It just has a big hole of like, well, what about Hitler? Did he slip through the cracks? Or, like how many people didn't get like zipped out at early age?
Or, why not think Jimmy could have been the next Mother Teresa, could have been the world's greatest person instead of the world's worst. So there's, all kinds of flaws there. One of the ones that a lot of people will say is they'll play the big mystery card. They'll say, look, God's ways are not our ways. Who are we to question a sovereign God? It's all in God's perfect, mysterious plan. Now, that's an attractive answer in part because, at least I don't want to claim I got God figured out. I mean, you've got a whole lot of hubris to walk around thinking you've got God figured out. So there's a certain kind of plausibility there, but I think it's a mystery card that goes too far. Because if you don't have a real good answer to the biggest question most people have, the number one reason atheists say they can't believe in God, then it seems like that's too big of a mystery. I sometimes like to put it this way. I can't worship a God of mystery to that kind of degree because I'll never know whom the devil that God might be. The play on words is that you're really asking me to question God's fundamental goodness. And at least for me personally, I begin with the view that God is a God of love. And I'm willing to rethink God's power in light of that. Wow. So to answer your question, I think the God of the universe loves everyone and everything. And because God's love is inherently uncontrolling, God can't control anyone or anything. Not that God won't stop that rape or won't stop that torture. God simply can't. Also, not that God is off on the sidelines watching popcorn, watching the disaster and not doing anything. No, I think God's fundamentally engaged at all levels of reality, at all times and all places, always influencing, calling, acting toward the good, but God can't control anyone or anything.
Hmm. Yeah, that's so. A lot of people probably. I'm trying to like think through all the different objections.
Yes.
Past me would certainly have a lot.
Yeah.
And one of the big ones is well, what do you mean God can't? Surely God can do everything. So are you just saying that on some level God chooses to be unable, or are you saying that there is fundamentally certain principles? I mean, this is way into the depths of metaphysics now, isn't it? Right? So
Yeah.
is there? This is in the weeds. It's really good.
Yes.
Are you saying there's fundamental things? So if we attribute one thing to God, you cannot have another attribution. God cannot be truly good and truly evil. So in the same sense, you could say God can't be evil because God is good.
Yes.
I think most people would probably not get too upset with that.
Yeah.
But when you start bringing it down to questioning things like his power, his knowledge, I mean, you ask people to name 3 components of who God is, and those are in the top 3, right? Every time it's like he knows all
Yeah.
things, he can do all things, and it's like, oh wait, you just listed the 2 things that I'm kind of trying to take off the table here. That's a huge thing, right? I mean, love is often very much in there, but I mean, these are like people rattle them off if you ask them to
Yes.
describe what is God like, or describe how God operates, or what makes God God. Even what makes God God. Well, I can be loving. God can be loving, sure, but I can't know everything. I can't do everything. So surely that makes him somehow more God than me, and therefore that's really essential. If we take that away,
Yeah.
So
Boy, there's
how
so
do you
many ways I can
engage
go
with
with
that?
that question.
Do it. Do them all.
Let me start with kind of more of the metaphysical thing, but I'm going to use terminology that's not technical. All right.
Sure.
There are 3 kind of options here that I like to talk about. One option, I'll call it voluntary divine self-limitation. This is the idea that God could control anyone or anything, but usually doesn't, because God makes a decision, freely doesn't intervene to stop some evil. That's the voluntary choice on God's part. I'm rejecting that view. So I'm not saying God chooses not to stop evil. I'm not going that route. On the other side of my view is the idea that God can't stop evil because God is constrained by these external forces, maybe the laws of nature or the devil or metaphysical laws or principalities and powers, these things that are outside of God. And God's like, oh man, I'd really like to step in and help out Phil here, but these things outside of me are stopping me from doing so.
Mm-hmm.
My view fits between those options. It says this: God really can't single-handedly stop evil in the world, not because God is constrained by external forces and not because God's just freely choosing not to, but it's God's very nature that decides what God can and can't do. God must be God, and God wouldn't be God if God was controlling. I sometimes point to this passage in Paul's writing to Timothy, in which Paul says, when we are faithless, God remains faithful because God cannot deny himself.
Mm.
There's some things God simply can't do, because to do them, God would have to deny himself, go against God's own nature. Now, lots of Christian theologians in history have affirmed that. They haven't done it quite the way I'm doing it, but they've said things like, God must exist. God can't say, it's been a good run, but I'm slipping into nothingness tomorrow. Nope. It's part of God's nature to exist. What I'm claiming is that it's God's nature to love. God must love. And this love is inherently uncontrolling.
Mm.
So that's the difference between the voluntary self-limitation or external limitation. It's a view to use the technical language, I call it essential kenosis, or the uncontrolling love of God view.
Okay. Yeah. Great. So it feels to me like I get that, and I like that. I wonder if there is a component of the knowledge within this, or of the knowing the future, that makes this plausible, because on some level it's a bit like what I was talking about. If you keep stepping back, eventually God becomes an asshole, right? So if you keep stepping back and you get to a point where God's going, yeah, so I am love and I'm not going to control any person. So let's just like let the ant farm out and see what happens. You know, it's like, well, if you know that 80% of them are going to burn in a crisp, depending on what you believe about eternal hell, or, you know, or if you know that, you know, 10% are going to die young, and a whole bunch of them are going to get cancer, and there's going to be earthquakes and stuff. That's going to be crazy. I mean, like tsunamis, and people are going to die in floods. And, you know, if you know all these kind of outcomes, you're going to go, oh, I'll tell you what, it's not that high a percentage to get a really great ride out of this.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Like, so on some level, at a certain point that God lays out a thing where he's going, so I'm going to create this and not be able to control anything, but just be in the midst of it, which I think is a really exciting and very fantastic and profound kind of way to engage with the divine and with life. But with the concept of knowing how this pans out and knowing how many people suffer, knowing how, do you understand that kind of component?
Yes.
So that's surely an absolutely essential component of the dynamic for God to have laid this out. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think there's two issues going on here. The open theist can say God doesn't know with absolute certainty how things are going to play out. So God's not an asshole, to use your language, because God didn't create it and know that, 5 billion people are going to disobey and cause evil. And if you believe in hell, go to hell, or whatever, be annihilated, whatever your afterlife view is. So that helps to overcome that. But there's another issue here. And here, open theists have differing views. So I don't want to sound like I'm speaking for all open theists.
Sure.
I'm going to speak for myself at this point. All right. Think about what's implied in thinking that God created in the first place. Not only God's motive, but if God's really a creator, was God creating before our world came into existence? My view is that God has always been creating, everlastingly. And God didn't create this universe out of absolute nothingness. That God is always in the business of creating in one moment out of that which God created in the previous moment. And that series is everlasting, had no beginning. Now, what this allows me to do is to say that A, creating is God's nature and God always does it. B, give a motive for God creating. I think God creates because love compels God to. If people who believe in creation out of nothing, who thinks God creates out of love, I want to say, okay, well, did God not love before God created? And they'll say something like, well, God loved in the Trinity. And I said, well, God loved God's self, but what about loving others? So my view can overcome that sort of objection. And it says that God always creates moment by moment out of that which God previously created, which means that the beginning of our universe, roughly 13 billion years ago, God creates and sets into motion an evolutionary process that God continues to create through, not knowing for sure how it's going to end up, but because love compels God to create others with whom God can have relationship, including complex creatures like you and me and dogs and dolphins, then God has a motive for that creating. And God then's not an asshole because of God's ability either to interrupt and stop evil or somehow foreknow exactly how the numbers are all going to crunch out from the start.
So that's a fascinating, I like that a lot. The fascinating component to me is I've heard different open theists kind of lay out the concept of knowing for sure the future and just being that powerful that you know every possibility and probability. And so the possibility probability component, the way I heard it explained was like, if you were to, you could sit a grandmaster chess player down opposite me and they don't know me at all. They don't know what I'm going to do. They certainly don't know what I'm going to do in chess because I don't know what I'm going to do and I don't know what I'm doing. But they know they're going to win. At very worst, they might have a stalemate and they'll play again. But on the whole, they can play 2 or 3 games and it might be a couple of stalemates in there, but they're going to win. I thought that was that was quite helpful thing for me to understand, of like, they just know all the options and they know what to do in every option that's the best option. And so unless they're met with someone that's actually their equal, they're going to win. And so there's this concept of that God knows he's going to win, whatever that means,
Here again, open theists
how does
have
that
different
work?
views.
Okay,
So
yeah.
some open theists like the chess master analogy because it does kind of say there's a certain number of possible moves. God knows all of them. God knows how to counteract all these certain ones to eventually get the win. Others say, well, no, that doesn't make a lot of sense because if there's no end to this process, I mean, unless you think that like the earth is going to end, we all go to heaven and time stops, well, then maybe there's an end. But most open theists think the time continues on in the afterlife. Then there's always going to be more possibilities, more freedom. And
Right.
so saying God can win or will win as if God can crunch all the numbers and know all the possible moves, that seems to be problematic in a truly open future. So one way to fix that, and this is not my view, but this is what some do, is they'll say, well, God typically doesn't intervene to control, but at the eschaton, God is going to kick some butt and make a decision. And then, there won't be free choice at that point, at least at the end of the age. And then maybe free choice will start again. But in some way, God's going to make a decisive closure on things.
Yeah.
I don't like that view because that implies God has the kind of power to control evil and isn't doing so right now.
Yeah.
So I'm not Clark Pinnock would be a person who likes that kind of an option.
I think I've read a book of his quite early on. He's written on open theism? Would that be?
Oh yes, yeah. He's
correct?
one of the main person here in the States on open theism.
I think it was Greg Boyd that put me onto him somehow. And I think Greg was very clear in saying, I don't agree with everything he writes, but here's a good person to check out. I think I talked to him on Twitter about it or something like that. He said, like, go and read this book or whatever. And I think, and I remember reading it, I'm like, this doesn't really fit with most of my other theology, if I'm honest. So the biggest problem I have is the obstacle of my eschatology, my afterlife, all sorts of different things planning out. But the concept of God, I guess, understanding probabilities and things like that very much, I could imagine, plays out in our day-to-day concept of what this looks like, right? And so that, I don't know, maybe there is, someone's going to make some really terrible decisions in their life and God's hanging out with me in the morning and maybe I'm a good Christian boy and I'm doing my quiet time and praying and I'm going, God, what do you want me to do today? And he says, I want you to get in your car and drive that way. And I somehow stop some sort of calamity, or because he knows, well, the probabilities are if you get in your car after you talk with me, I can shift and I can talk and encourage you to make a choice. Like, to me, that makes life a lot more exciting in a sense, right? I mean, because God suddenly steps in and I'm like, what's happening next? He's like, I don't know, but I've got some ideas, as opposed to, all right, I've pre-planned absolutely everything out. And even though you're even asking me, I knew you were going to ask me and you were going to do this either way. Or like, it kind of feels boring for God. Do you ever think about that kind of dynamic as well? Like, it's like watching a movie like a billion times or something. Do you know what I mean? It's this kind of dynamic, but it becomes very exciting suddenly when you kind of whittle it down into, so how does, and again, there's multiple views of open theism, and we probably could go into a lot of that because that sounds fascinating. And I'm not as aware of, even in reading different people, I've probably just lumped them into one group and not really picked up on the nuances. But at least for you, how has this shifted how you've engaged with God and lived in a kind of more nitty gritty day-to-day life? Has it changed how you do things day in, day out?
Tons of things, tons. Yeah. For one thing, open theism in general just makes a lot more sense with how most of us live our daily lives. Like when I give lectures at universities or churches or conferences, I almost always have someone come up afterwards and say something like this: what you've just been talking about makes so much sense to me, and I've already believed it, but I've never had the words to articulate it. It just works with the way I live my life. And that is thinking that we have real freedom, but not freedom to do anything. It's limited, but it's genuine freedom. that our choices make a difference. It affects our lives and others. We live in an interrelated world. That God's a God of love who's not in the business of kicking our butt and torturing us. All these things that just kind of fits the way most people think. But the one that probably has made the biggest difference to me lately is, and I talk about it some at the end of chapter 5 in God Can't, is the idea that God really needs us. A lot of theologians today want to get away from the God who predestines everything, but they also want to retain a God who's got the kind of omnipotent power to fix things single-handedly sometime in the future. And this God, from their perspective, invites you and me to participate in what God's doing in the world, but it really doesn't matter if we participate, at least not in the ultimate scheme of things, because most of these people are kind of universalists and everybody's going to go to heaven anyway, and God's got this plan and God can kick butt if God wants to. And so you get the impression that even though God is inviting us to participate, it really doesn't matter if we cooperate, because God's going to get the job done anyway.
Yeah. And he'd probably do it better without us, right? A bit like
Exactly.
a parent like going, hey, kiddo, do you want to bake some cookies with me? And you're like, these cookies are not going to be good now, but they'll rescue them. You know, they'll make it work.
Yeah.
But we know that the parent can cook the cookies all right.
Yeah. And then the kid gets old enough to figure that out. And there's like, okay, you know, why am I cooking? Why don't you cook? You do a better job.
Yeah. Well, it's maybe it's not quite the right words, or there's maybe some components of intent behind it, but it feels quite condescending in a sense, doesn't it?
Yes.
You know, because it's like this, oh, hey, kiddo, you want to help me out? You know, and it's like, really, you want me to help you? Do you need me to help you? Or are you just trying to mollycoddling, you know, trying to placate me so I've got something to do? Because I want to go play on the Xbox, really, you know?
And interestingly, that word condescending is exactly the word theologians have used to talk about God's relation to the world. God condescended to do something.
Wow.
And I don't like it at all. My view says something that will sound radical to some people, but reassuring to others. It says that in order for love to win now and in the future, you and I in creation actually have to cooperate with God. Our lives matter. We're ultimately significant. Things can't be done that God wants to see done unless we cooperate. Now, when I say that in a public audience, I can almost see by the body responses to people how they're affected.
Yeah.
Like a certain portion of the audience, their shoulders go back and they're like, yeah, I've always kind of thought my life mattered. And now here's a theology that affirms that. Yeah. And then other people, their shoulders kind of slump and they're like, you got to be kidding me. What I do matters. Oh, that sucks, you know? And so I try to tell the second group of people that, you know, you're not carrying the whole world on your shoulders. God's calling you to do something particular to you and your abilities right here and right now. What you do matters. Your response matters, but don't think that the whole world is on your shoulders. And not only is God calling you to do something, God also is empowering you to respond to that call. You just have to cooperate. But the overall point to your question, yes, this affects the way I think about my life and what I do day to day.
That's really interesting. Like, I know for me, when I started talking a bit about open theism here and there, and I used to help teach in a school, like a ministry school, and I do a session every year on this, to much of people's existential crises. But one of the things, like, I remember early on going, when I first came across this thing, I was like, I don't know what I believe about this. I just really don't know, but it sounds compelling. And I was like, you know what, God? I'm just going to live as though open theism's a thing for about a month. Let's just see how it feels. And that's genuinely, I was like, very much like, God's a big boy, girl, whatever, you know, they'll survive. Yeah. They'll be okay with Phil going off the rails for a month, you know, just testing it out, you know? And I genuinely, this is the kind of stuff that really hit me, is suddenly, regardless of where I've ended up now, even I can look back at that trial period and gone, whoa, my day-to-day life, it meant something. And I really felt that, like, in every action I felt, now I say in every action when I was awake enough to be aware of what was going on and actually think about it, right? Which is probably about 4 times a day if I was lucky. But in every moment where I was thinking and I was aware of like, okay, God, what's happening? Where are we going? What do you need? There was a much greater reality of God's presence in amongst it. It wasn't that he was up in the sky as a puppeteer. It wasn't that he was the angel on my shoulder going, Phil, no, please don't do that, or whatever. God was there. He was like, dude, well, we could do this or this. What do you think? It was really that. And I'm like, I know. What do you think? You're God. What's the best option? He's like, well, maybe B, but you do what you want and we'll figure it out. And like, it was really exciting. It came to life, this concept.
Think about the difference between that view that you're describing. We'll call it the openness view here just because that's the way we've been talking.
Sure.
And the view that some people have of a God who's sovereignly in control of everything. People who have that kind of a view really emphasize obedience. Like God said it, you have to obey, you have to do it and not because there's some sort of reason, but God said it, period. End of sentence. But if you're an open theist and you think God is calling you to, I don't know, care for the earth, you're doing it not only because God is calling you to, but because you think your actions might actually make a difference in what the overall scope of things is all about. And there's a kind of a purpose, which means you have to think about, first of all, if you're understanding God, you're discerning what the Spirit's doing, but also then what that means in terms of how I'm going to, I guess I was talking about the planet. So how am I going to act toward the planet how am I going to care for creation and all the kinds of things we would want to talk about there. So there's a lot more real investment on who I am and how I'm responding and what I'm doing than the view that, well, God's in control and we're just supposed to obey. I mean, you still have problems discerning what God wants in that view, but
sure, of course. We all got voices in our heads, right? At the end of the day,
yeah. But it's just a very different kind. I guess I can't. One of the values of open theism is it really works well with love metaphors, love in a partnership or family. Like, I don't want my kids just to obey me because they're afraid I'll beat them if they don't. I want my kids to obey me because they realize that's a good idea, Dad, and this is going to make it better for everybody. And that's the difference, I think, between open theism and sort of this top-down, sovereignly in control kind of God.
Yeah. Yeah, and even possibly a little more controversial, but I'm sure you probably wouldn't disagree. Like on a whole nother level, I don't want my kids to obey me all the time. Sometimes I'm like, dude, that's a cool idea. You went on a whole another way. It's probably not the choice I would have made, but that's awesome. I'm really excited to see how it pans out for you. Like, and you're going to learn something through this, or like there's an element of at times. That's not the important thing, that we're doing my dictated plan,
Right.
I think most parents on some level are going, yeah, of course, I'm not like trying to strong arm my kid into becoming a doctor or an engineer, but we all have that moment of like, oh, bummer, they've chose to be an artist or whatever, how am I going to pay for retirement now?
Yeah.
But I think that this concept of obedience is a really fascinating one once you start kind of like peeling back the layers, even that concept of God being like, well, you need to obey me and that's the way it is.
Yes.
Like, well, if I don't, is that because you predestined me to disagree with your demands and therefore was I going to do that? And, it's a whole can of worms that you just kind of endlessly keep opening, isn't it?
There's another way to think about this that I sometimes will talk about. And that is, if you have the view that God is foreknown and predestined everything, and God has a will for you, it's probably going to be one single action each moment that God wants you to do. But if you have the idea that the future is open, God is calling you to do what's loving, beautiful, flourishing, it could be that there are multiple options that are just as good as the other. Yeah. And so being an artist or a doctor might be overall, the possibilities for flourishing and well-being, and to use Christian language, the kingdom of God in his fulfillment might still be there. God can't know with certainty. Now, God knows that, you being a pimp or a drug dealer, that's not going to promote the kingdom. But there are lots of other options that might be relatively similar in value. And so you kind of can be free to explore in a way that you don't feel free if you think God's got that one thing that you got to figure out what you need to do in the next moment, that one person you're supposed to marry, that one career you're supposed to have, whatever.
It's really interesting. How do you think, this is something I'm fascinated by, and I guess different open theists will engage with this quite differently, just based on a couple of things you said so far, but how do you incorporate or reconcile the concept of prophecy into all of this?
Yeah, there are different views, but I can give you kind of a general thing. First of all, the first statement would be not something that just open theists would say, but most scholars, Christian and Jewish scholars would say. They would say the vast majority of prophecy in the Bible is not predictive prophecy. It's prophecy in which the prophet stands up and says, look, people, you guys are following idols, you're sinning, you need to change, otherwise things are going to suck. God's not happy about this. Now, you don't have to know the future with certainty to know that sin
that will
sucks.
pan out at some point.
Yeah. So, but there is a narrower section of passages in Scripture that sound more predictive. Now, in those passages, the majority of those are God saying, I'm going to do something in the future. I'm going to do X, Y, and Z. Well, God can have plans to do something in the future and not know the future exhaustively. But there are a small number of passages that are predictive prophecies that seem to have to do with something creatures are going to do. And it sounds like somehow God foreknows it's all going to take place. My favorite illustration of this is Jesus saying to Peter, before the cock crows twice, you'll deny me 3 times.
That's a great example.
Man, that sounds so specific, and setting aside the question of whether or not Jesus has foreknowledge. But let's just say at the moment, Jesus could at least access the divine mind and God has exhaustive foreknowledge.
Sure.
Well, that would seem to be an argument for that view. Now, open theists have particular ways of handling that. Greg Boyd's got certain ways. Sometimes people will say, well, that's just a colloquialism. I can't even say the word, that the cock crows twice. It's kind of like a saying. Other people will say, well, Jesus knew Peter so well that Jesus could predict it. I don't actually buy the usual solutions that open theists put up here. I say about that verse, that just doesn't fit open theism very well. But I think the majority of the Bible does fit open theism well. So I don't think every last little bit of Scripture has to tie in nicely together into a systematic theology.
Do you think with something like that, it's probably a lot more likely that within the author of the gospel, he's writing a narrative, he's writing something that plays out, he's trying to make it like, dramatic, fit, wonderful. Even though you look at something like 70 AD prophecy or something, it's like, well, it's written after 70 AD, it's like, things like this, you're like, well, yes, but none of these authors of the gospels actually walked with Jesus day in, day out anyway. So, were they there detailing this exact 70 AD, or is this past?
It's highly unlikely.
There's a lot of these dynamics in play as well, I'm sure, that maybe some more literists probably aren't going to be happy with. But
yes, that's right. Yeah, those are always tools you can bring into the conversation, and I'm quite willing to do so. But my main point is, I think open theism can account for the vast majority of prophecy in the Scripture, the stuff that isn't predictive, the stuff that is predictive, but there are some things that open theism I don't think accounts well for, and I'm fine with that. I can live with that because I think it accounts for the majority better than the idea that God somehow foreknows everything into the future.
That's really interesting. Yeah, it's a whole world I've probably not delved nearly deep enough in. I kind of studied it for maybe 5, 6 little books or things like that, and then put together a little introduction and said, here's some ideas, here's some thoughts, here's how to kind of understand baseline what it is. Now go and read all the books I read and more. So it's really interesting to pick your brains on this. So I know that you are gearing up to release, and by the time this comes out, it's probably going to come out in about 3 weeks. When's your book coming out? About then?
I'm not exactly sure, but sometime in July. So,
okay, so
this might
on
come
the
out
cusp.
before. Yeah.
But you're gearing up to release, and it's a follow-up to your book, God Can't. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah. The title is Questions and Answers for God Can't, and it's 9 chapters in which I address some of the main questions I get from people who send me, Facebook messages, emails, or people who come to my lectures, or whatever. Things like, how can you believe in miracles if God can't control? How should you pray if God can't control? What about eschatology? How do you understand God's action? Where does Jesus fit into all this? Those kinds of things. And so I tried to write this book in very accessible way, kind of like I did God Can't. It may be a little more technical than God Can't, but it's still pretty accessible.
Well, people are begging you to dig down into the nitty gritty a bit
That's
more.
right.
So you have to kind of on some level.
Yeah, that's right.
That's fascinating, because I'm like, this is my first thought as well when I'm like looking at this. You present a new idea, and I'm like, oh, I've got some questions, I've got some ideas. I'm trying to think on other people's behalfs, but you've been asked these questions more than anyone probably.
Yeah,
well, like, hey, I read your book. What the heck do you do with this? And it gets to the point. I know I get a lot of messages about stuff I've said, and they're like, well, what about this and what about that? And you get to the point where you're like, right, I've answered this email 28 times. I'm not doing it 29 times. I'm just going to write a whole thing. I'll copy and paste it each time. So you get to the point where, like, I'm just going to write a book. And so it's fascinating thinking about these concepts. Like something like miracles. How do you go into that? Because I mean, I can understand at a very cursory level, like a surface level. You've got, okay, well, God needs to work through us. So like, yes, this person needs healing, and God wants to heal them. That's his desire, but he can't heal them. He can't just like storm in and ruin this guy's day by healing him. How does that do? Because at a certain point, even when we're involved, there's a God going, all right, let's make this happen. And there's plenty of times where we're involved and that person's involved and it doesn't happen as well.
That's right. Yes.
Yeah. Do you wrestle with that?
You are working exactly in the direction that I want to work. So one of the big issues is I want to return us back to the idea that God can't single-handedly bring about results. So any miracle that occurs in the world can't just be God acting alone. There either has to be cooperation from creatures, or in the case of inanimate creatures, there has to be the conditions of creation have to be conducive for the miracle to occur. But this also overcomes the problem of blaming the victim, the cancer patient who's been praying and cooperating as best this person knows how, but they still have cancer. It overcomes that by saying, look, you've got agents and factors and actors in your body that you can't control, and neither can God. So while your cooperation might be the key in some instances, your body might not be cooperating in others. So it kind of lays out all these kinds of factors to bring into to account for why sometimes there are miracles, but oftentimes there are not miracles. So you'll have to get the book.
Oh, no, I know. I'm fascinated. Because my first thought in that is like, yeah, that makes sense. I was involved with the charismatic movement for a long time, and I've been involved in, Pentecost, a whole bunch of different movements. And just the nature of what I do, I work with people in lots of different backgrounds. But that concept starts to line up and make sense to me. I'm like, yeah, okay, I get that. But Jesus had a bloody high success rate, didn't he? And so it's like, if we're going, well, okay, so I believe in healing, and I'm gonna, rumba shamba over this person, and and pray for healing over them, and they are going, I want to be healed. I give you all full access, right? There's no controlling issues here. God, heal me up, and it doesn't click. Surely those two components mean that, okay, so it's something else. We're talking something physiologically. We're talking, I don't know. Necessarily, I'm not a medic, so I couldn't go into the details of what that might look like. But surely Jesus had those issues as well. How would you?
What's really interesting is
how that works.
Once I started really looking at this carefully, like I'm like you, I used to be a healing evangelist and pray for people, and be all into that sort of stuff. But once I came back to it with this uncontrolling love perspective, I saw things in the gospel I never noticed before. Like Jesus goes to the pool of Bethsaida where all these people are invalids. That's the way usually English translators
As it's,
translate the Greek, and he only heals one guy.
mm,
All these people are there, and Jesus only heals one. And even that one, it's a second try. He puts mud on his eyes and he doesn't get it the first time round. Jesus goes to many places according to Mark, and one particular passage in the book that I've just written, it says all of the sick people were brought to Jesus, and Jesus healed many. Not all, many. And my favorite passage is when Jesus goes to his hometown and doesn't heal because they don't have faith. It's explicit there. So once I had this kind of lens on my eyes of uncontrolling love, I started noticing lots of times in which people weren't healed, or at least not everybody was healed. And I thought, oh, the Bible doesn't actually present Jesus as this healing machine who just knocks them down one by one and cleans up all the time.
Yeah.
There's actually more going on here than I realized.
It's amazing how a hermeneutic can do that, can't it? It just kind of creates this like blinders. I see that, oh yeah, it's there, and there. Clearly. And we all do it. You know, I mean, we all do it. But yeah,
sometimes when I speak, I'll make a big wager. I'll say, I've got $1,000 to give to anyone here tonight who can find one passage in the entire Bible that explicitly says God controlled to make something happen, and there was no creaturely contribution by agents or factors in creation. Nothing. Give me one. From the hardening of Pharaoh's heart to the creation of the world, to the resurrection of Jesus, to the miracles. Like I'll say, you give me one. And what people will do is they'll start throwing out examples. You know, what about Jesus walking on water? And I'll say, does it explicitly say creation didn't cooperate? No, I'm not saying I've got all these perfect explanations. I actually do have some explanations, but I'm not saying I've got all these explanations, but I'm saying, does the text require us to think that God controls in a single-handed way? We come to the Bible with these assumptions, and I used to have them as well, that, okay, maybe God doesn't control everybody, but God could if God wanted to. And look, there's an example that only mentions God. That must have been a controlling event, when the Bible doesn't explicitly say that.
Yeah, no, we're really, really good at that. I'm very good at it, certainly.
We all are. Yeah, it's just the nature of being human. We have assumptions.
Yeah. Wow. So how do you know, let's go right back to the young guy coming out of college, going to his pastor, going, I'm not sure what I think about Jesus. Now you're kind of like fast forward into the future, and here we are. And who knew? God didn't. But you know, we're here, and the pastor, you know, you decide, I'm going to jack this in and go to become an associate pastor again, or youth pastor. The pastor goes, what's the deal with open theism and Jesus? And how does, you know, this concept of God coming to earth in the right time and the right way to save all of humanity, whatever that means, you know, there's obviously 110 different dynamics of what Jesus's life means that we could go into, but it feels like the predominant narrative across most of Christianity is that this was very foreknown. He was going to do it on some level. God knew, I'm going to come to earth as a man and do my thing, whatever his thing was. We could probably go for that forever, but you know, that's probably not the area to focus on. But like, is that falling into the prophecy area again, where it's not massively specific? God could have just gone, this feels like a good time. Let's just dive in here. Mary seems cool. You know, there's no consent jokes there. But you know, like, let's just make it happen here. Let's bring Jesus. Is that kind of how you would see things, or is there exceptions to the rule? It sounds like you're not very wavering on exceptions to the rules. You're very much like, no, this is the way it works, and it's where it works.
Yeah, it's not so much that I've got all the answers. It's more that I want a consistent and coherent theology. I get sick and tired of people playing mystery cards left and right when the theology runs into a brick wall. And I don't want to allow that for others, so I don't want to allow it for myself. So what I want to do is, maybe this is the way to think about it, Phil. I want to take the logic of love and play it out through every dimension of reality and theology all the way down the line. So you bring up Mary. You know, most people don't even acknowledge that Mary says, "Be it unto me." She's a cooperative agent here.
Mm.
This isn't the Spirit unilaterally, this is not non-consensual sex, at least not according to the passage.
Yep.
So once you have that logic of love in place, like I'm trying to do,
Mm.
then you're reading through the scriptures and you're saying, okay, what fits here and what doesn't? And the stuff that doesn't, is it not fitting because have these assumptions that I could rearrange, or is there really just a contradiction here? And to be honest, I haven't found very many contradictions. The clearest contradictions I find in the Bible, to my view, are views in which God is simply portrayed as unloving. It's not an issue of power. It's an issue of God, of the writers thinking that God wants them to bash their enemies' babies' heads against the rocks. There are those passages in scripture, and I don't want to sugarcoat those. But I think the majority of scripture points to a God of love. And the main themes, even in the Old Testament, point to this God of steadfast love. And of course, Jesus, I think, is the best representation. So all that to say, what I'm trying to do when it comes to prophecy, when it comes to the incarnation, eschatology, is ask myself the questions of love. And for the most part, things line up. I think I have a theology that's consistent. I wouldn't say that my theology fits every passage of scripture because of what I've already said about some portraying God as unloving.
Yeah, no, that's really good. That's really, really interesting. I grew up in a very mixed bag, but at one point I was very much in a very fundamental movement of kind of brethren, ex-brethren, but they were ex-brethren solely because they just didn't want to tie to the brethren like institution, but they still wanted to be brethren. So they're very brethren, very kind of very Calvinistic, very 5-point. It was fascinating to me that their position on, what is good and what is love was very much like, well, what God does. That's what love is. Yeah. So you could, I know he says kill everyone here, man, woman, child, and then keep the young females and rape them. That's fine. That's love. That's good.
Yep.
God said it. I know earlier you said that's kind of like not the dynamic you would work with it, because it just introduces this kind of like weird arbitrary mystery of like, well, if I can find a loophole at some point in the scripture where God's pro killing people, God's pro rape in this scenario. Oh, well, then in some ways that will be good at times. You get to the point where you're John Piper, going, oh yeah, well, the 2 towers going down was a good thing. God ordained it. It was supposed to be. That's the way it is. It becomes this very arbitrary thing. So when you're constantly measuring everything by this foundational belief that God is to be measured by love, God is to be measured as a good God.
I think John Piper is a good, before you ask the question, let me quickly throw in something. I think John Piper is a really good example here because I admire John Piper's rational consistency.
He's very consistent.
I think his theology sucks. It's horrific. But I try to also be consistent. It's just that I have a different fundamental starting point. It's the starting points of love. And because of that, I'm willing to make some moves some people think are really radical, like God can't do some things. I actually think I can support them biblically, but it sounds really radical to most people. But I share in Piper's vision that I want a coherent theology that doesn't throw mystery cards left and right when we come up against hard questions.
Yeah. No, I often say on this podcast, people will get fed up of me saying it, but I really admire people like Piper. I admire people like Westboro Baptist. I mean, some of the worst kind of theological outplays you could have. But I'm like, dang, do they believe what they believe? And are they on it? Like, I mean, when some tragedy happens, I know what John Piper's going to say because I know what John Piper believes. I've read like 7-8 of his books. I know what he believes. I was a good brethren. I was a good 5-point Calvinist. I followed Piper and Mark Driscoll and all these guys. I know. And that's Piper's not going to change unless he has a radical shift. We're going to get the same party line.
Yeah, he's not going to stand up and say, well, God didn't want this to happen, but he allowed it. Nope. He's going to say, this is sovereign will of God, that those people got killed in the fire. Yeah.
Who knows? Maybe he'll read your book. Maybe the next time the tweet is, well, I mean, God can't do some stuff. That would be a tweet.
That's right. I love it.
So my question was, and I think it's a fascinating question, because I think we all do this with our own lenses and our own abilities and our own subjective frailties. But how do you draw these lines? Because on some level, you go, well, we don't like the mystery of going, well, is this murder good or is it a bad murder? I don't know. It depends, because God likes and hates murder. It just depends what page you turn to. We can all kind of have certain benchmarks for what is love and what is good that we're measuring God to, and we're creating this framework and going, okay, cool. So he obviously can't do certain things because this is my concept of love. How do you underpin that? I know lots of people would point to different concepts within the scriptures, with the scriptures, their own kind of morality of humans on a more metaphysical level, the concept of ethics and morals. Like, how do you kind of draw the line in the sand for that? Because it's a complex thing, right? I mean, the Westboro Baptists, they would say it's loving to go and, I don't know, call people horrific things or pick at a funeral. And they really believe that's love. Now, presumably that's not your conclusion. You've not decided on the same kind of scenario, because their love is like what's true, or, I don't know how they quite get to that at times, but, we all do it different ways, I guess is my point. You can be an abusive father and think that's loving.
Well, I think what you're fundamentally asking me is what theologians would say, what's my theological method? That is, how do I decide what things I think are right, wrong, true, best, worst, whatever? And I think I'll answer that in two ways. One is to say, I've really been influenced by what in theology people call the quadrilateral, named after John Wesley. And for those of your listeners who never heard of that, that's basically a way of saying that when it comes to trying to figure out who God is, what God wants, how we ought to live in the world, understand theology, we ought to draw from the Bible, that's one, the tradition, that's the second, reason, third, and experience, fourth. Now, this is something that emerged in the 20th century. John Wesley never used the word quadrilateral. In fact, he never used all four of those things together. But what people began to realize is that when we do theology, we're drawing from a variety of sources, trying to make sense of things. And I like that approach. Now, let me say that the mirror of that in the sciences is the scientific method. That is, I think good science makes inferences. It looks at data, it has theories, it tries to propose a most plausible theory, not knowing with certainty it's the right one, always being open to adjustment, giving new data, new experiences that come down the line. And so both of these work together then to try to make sense of reality, always making adjustments. And one of the big pieces that will distinguish me from the Westboro Baptists is this idea of what experience is, that our experience of what love is isn't killing people, isn't putting up signs saying God hates fags at the funerals of homosexual people, whatever. So there's a kind of drawn upon our experience of life that's going to play a role, not the only role, but a role in my theological method of trying to construct the best overall theology. But I'm not going to say, hey, I've got it finally worked out. Here it all is. I've deduced it down to these 6 principles. I do have certain principles, but they're always open to adjustment. There's always open to change, because I think I'm always trying to learn new things.
Sure. Yeah, because I think the thing that fascinates me about this is that when I think about how I love, even just how I love my wife, that has changed over the years, and she is thankful, very, very thankful.
It better have changed.
And she's maybe at times very dismayed that it's changed in other ways. But on the whole, the way it changes is I realize, oh gosh, this way of acting towards this other person, it's not very loving. I need to reevaluate who I am and how I operate. And so there's this element of a subjectivity of what I understand to be loving, and an awareness to be able to learn afresh, oh, this might be more loving to do it a different way, a different idea. So that, yes, textually, I can argue my love right now, but in 5 years, when my love changes, I'll still be able to point to the text. I'll just probably use different ones or interpret them differently. And yes, I can point to the tradition and I can go, oh yeah, within Orthodoxy, this is what love looks like. But so could the Westboro Baptist Church, probably on some level, right? I mean, and so there's these components.
It's not like the tradition has just one view. I mean, the tradition is diverse. Yeah.
So I guess it's such a complex, it's a very complex thing. So I was fascinated to hear your thought. I first came across that the quadrilateral kind of concept through Michael Hardin's book, The Jesus-Driven Life. I don't know if you've read it. It's phenomenal.
I know of him, but I haven't read that book.
His book is the #1 book I recommend. Like,
really?
I say it often, he doesn't mind me saying it, but I'm like, it's one of the hardest books I've ever waded through, as far as it was not written at a 5th grade, reading level. And it's not hard to read either. It's just fairly easy to read. But for some reason, I'm like, God, this is taking me, I'm having to revisit. I'm having to read over and over. It's a very, very good book. But he explores that as his hermeneutic is very much grounded in God is, it looks like Jesus. That God is redefined in Jesus, and Jesus kind of draws a line in the sand and goes, look at this old text. You have people's opinion, God's opinion of himself.
Yeah,
they're very much intermingled until you bring Jesus into play and kind of allow him to divide that kind of read backwards kind of concept and all this.
But even then, I mean, we have different views of Jesus, so it's not like Jesus provides
complex, right?
Crystal clarity.
Yeah. So we keep bringing in all these different things. You've got the scripture, you've got the historical Jesus, you've got the traditional concept of Jesus. You have all these different things, and it's such I don't want to be a modernistic, nihilistic kind of like there is nothing but subjectivity.
No.
But at the end of the day, there is on some level nothing but subjectivity, and so it can be problematic. And so I was wondering how you kind of draw your lines in the sand and figure that out. And I guess as your concepts of love have evolved, I guess that's probably not going to play too much into your open theism, because of the dynamic of love not being controlling is a fairly kind of solid principle. It's probably not going to shift too much, I imagine. But yeah.
No, I think love being uncontrolling, it fits nicely with open theism, but you could be an open theist and think that God's love sometimes meant controlling others.
Sure.
I don't think that's the case, but you could be an open theist there. I was going to make a comment about your what I would call the questions of relativism. And that is, whether or not everything is subjective to my own way of looking at the world. I like to make a distinction between extreme relativism and relativism that takes into account multiple perspectives.
Yeah.
I think we all ought to be relativists in that sense. But extreme relativism says there's no objective standards or no anything that one must or can embrace that can be universal in some sense. And I actually think there's some universals, at least universals in terms of how we live our lives, maybe not universals in particular propositions. And let me give you a few of them just to throw them out there.
Yeah.
Here's one. Every person I know believes there's good and worse. We have lots of differences of opinions on what the good and worse are, but that there is values in the world, some of which are better and worse. We all have that fundamental assumption. I call it an experiential non-negotiable. Here's another one. Every person I know thinks there's a world beyond their minds. They're not what we call in philosophy solipsists. Now, they may walk around saying they're a solipsist, but the way they act shows that they actually don't believe that, because their actions betray that they think there is a world. And you punch them in the nose and they say, ouch. Or how about another one? This is more controversial. Every person I know thinks they have some degree of choice in a particular moment, something like freedom. Even those people who say they're totally determined by their genes or by God or by what, everybody acts as if they themselves or other people have some measure of freedom. So that when you have a politician who does something, people don't say, oh man, his genes determined him to do that. No, they act as if he could have done something else and he had a real free choice to do so.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So again, now we'll have all kinds of differences of opinion on how much freedom we have, or at particular times looking at others, whether or not they were mostly shaped by their environment. There's all kinds of variables, but there are these, what I call experiential non-negotiables. We all live our lives as if these things are true, even if we might verbally say they're not true.
Yeah.
That gets us out of extreme relativism without thinking there's all these absolutes and these, everybody just, should know what they are and they control us. It provides plenty of space for differences of opinions and relativism in a non-extreme way.
Yeah, no, that's really good. And I think that's, it's ultimately all we can do is accept that, okay, I'm subjective and I can't experience the world apart from this subject.
Yes.
But apart from me maybe presuming that I'm in a mental or I'm just like some being that has imagined this whole thing in this whole world, apart from imagining that and assuming that you are a you, well, now I have two subjective beings that can share their subjectivity, and now we're a little less subjective on some level.
Yeah.
And the more I can do that, the more I can spread the load, right? I mean, that's part of one of the beauties of looking at, you look at the four views, you go, oh, we can look at tradition. We can look at how thousands and millions of people have lived their lives and experienced this across the board. Yeah, it's very varied, but there's a lot of common themes in here that people generally speaking are going, yeah, we think this is probably the way it works. I think that's a huge kind of equalizer in a lot of ways. Do you think those are timeless, or do you think those are often, I guess, different depending on different examples that you might give? But I guess I'm thinking,
I actually think those are metaphysically timeless.
You do? Yeah.
Timeless in this, not timeless like in the sense of for instance, I think cause and effect is metaphysically necessary, but by definition, I think it's time full. I mean, there's a cause and an effect, so that's sequential. So if you mean by timeless, like these are true of any possible world, I think there are some things that are true of all possible worlds.
Yeah. Because I'm just very aware that there's certain things. This is one of the reasons I love philosophy, and this is something my wife introduced me to talking to philosophy, and her background's that, and her dad's got I think a master's in philosophy, and then he went on to do like PhD in like astrophysics. I mean, the guy is crazy smart. So around their kitchen table, for lunch and stuff, he'd be like, here's a thing we're going to discuss, is good a thing, or whatever. And this is how they grew up, So I'm like, oh man, this is how I wanted to grow up. I did not grow up that way. We grew up going, here's the thing, we're all going to fight and whoever wins gets the last bread roll, I mean, that's how that's our dinner table. So she introduced me to, I guess, the concept that there were first thoughts. And so there's this moment where you can look throughout history and someone goes, what if everything's made of little things? And then suddenly we can't not think that way. And so there's a brand new way of exploring the world that we can't even, it's really hard for us to go beyond that initial thought and enter into the mind of those prior to that. And good example is maybe you try and teach your kids what numbers are, and it's so freaking frustrating because you can't conceptualize not understanding that's one, that's two. This is really easy, Timmy. Get it together,
Yes.
But they're like, what are you talking about? They might think, so you're saying that's red and that's blue, or they don't know what numbers are yet.
And that's
so
great
we can't go back to that. Sorry. So I guess I'm intrigued by how many things we presume. Oh yeah, everyone thinks this. Everyone thinks there's some sort of consciousness. Well, that's fascinating. But did we always? Will we always? And so I'm fascinated by some of these components as well. I don't know if you have thoughts on that, or
I don't think we can know with certainty these what I call experiential non-negotiables, but I think we are foolish to pretend that they don't affect the way they live our lives. It's what Jürgen Habermas calls them. Performative contradictions. I won't go down the philosophy road, but just to say, these do seem to be the way that we live our lives. And if we're going to construct some kind of philosophy or theology or explanation for things, we're really foolish if we ignore the things we all inevitably do in our actions. We need to incorporate those. That doesn't, again, make it totally complete system, but we need to incorporate them in our project.
Yeah, that's really great. So we should probably start wrapping up, but I mean, I've absolutely loved this, and I feel like I could just pick your brain on 110 different concepts. For those that want to go deeper, so obviously they should pick up your book, God Can't, and they should pick up the follow-up to answer all the questions that they have after reading God Can't.
Thank you.
And that's available, beginning of July, everywhere, Amazon, Kindle, Audible, and all that kind of stuff.
All that stuff.
You've presumably written on this in other places on blogs. You've probably done some interviews and stuff that people might be able to find on YouTube and stuff. Is that fair to say? If they kind of Google your name, there'll come some stuff?
Yeah, I've written or edited 25 books, and so you'll find some of this in some of those.
But also, work cut out for them if they want to go deep.
That's right. Probably the easiest, and in terms of time, if you just sort of go on my website and do a search function, and you're likely to find some of the answers or topics at least that you want to explore. And my website is my full name, which is Thomas Jay Oord, and J is JAYOORD.com.
Right.
But there's actually something else, and I'm not just going to say this for your listeners, but this might interest you as well, Phil.
Sure.
My primary job now is directing doctoral students who are pursuing a doctorate in theology and ministry in open and relational studies. And this is a fully online doctoral program in the Oxford style, which means students work individually with me on projects, reading through things toward their doctoral degree, and is not only fully online, but because it's online, it's a lot less expensive than a lot of other doctoral programs.
Yeah, I bet.
This is through, it's a joint collaboration with a startup seminary called Northwind Theological Seminary. And if you just, search Northwind Theological Seminary, you'll find my program on there. And a Center for Open and Relational Theology, which I direct. And so these two groups have come together to make this doctorate. I'm going to make an announcement later this week. My first group of students, I think there's 10 right now. There might even be up to 12 by the end of the week. But you or some of the people who are listening might be interested in pursuing a doctoral degree with me in themes like we've been talking about the last 2 hours.
Well, I tell you, I say to my wife every other day through us, I'm like, at some point I want to go back into that world. I barely have time to eat most days. And so I'm just like, I have no idea. I know my entire life is only going to get busier. We don't even have kids right now. I'm like, I have no idea where I'm ever going to find time. I spend like 5-6 hours a day talking to people and kind of pastoring them. I put out material. I'm doing podcasts, 3-4 times a day a week, talk to people for 3 hours. I'm like, how the hell am I going to do some sort of academic
But in
pursuit?
a lot of ways, I mean, I don't know you well. I don't know your life. But if you're putting together podcasts, you're doing interviews, you're already in the midst of the discussion intellectually.
I can.
What you're basically doing
transpose
is
this into a thesis.
Yes, yes. And
absolutely.
And let me say something specific on that real quick. Because I'm an innovative kind of person, I have opened a variety of ways to do your final project in this doctorate. Some people are going to write kind of more of a standard dissertation. Other people are going to do something more practical related to, case studies or, something like that. But I'm also open to innovative kinds of expressions for the doctoral degree. And I don't even know exactly what that looks like, but, I don't know, maybe it's something to do with computer programming or podcasting. I don't know. Something worthy of kind of the culmination of doing this work. So you might be able to incorporate some of the things you're doing right now into that.
Yeah. Well, I'm working with a research company in the UK, and we're doing a lot of research on the deconstruction kind of movement. And we're doing a kind of meta study over multiple years where we're doing regular surveys and diving deep into kind of who is this group, what are they thinking, who goes into this, who deconstructs, what happens after people deconstruct, what areas do people land or settle? Do people settle or do they keep going? Or, is this a seasonal thing? Is it long-term? And we're looking at all these different dynamics.
That's
and so
awesome.
Part of what I'm talking with them about is at some point I might turn this meta study into kind of maybe a doctoral kind of candidacy. Who knows? So maybe we should talk at some point about all this.
Definitely.
But so should other
Definitely.
people. I'll put these links in the show notes for people that are
Thank
listening
you.
as well, so they don't have to kind of remember all these buzzwords and Google them. They can just look in the
Yeah.
show notes and click the buttons. But yeah, that's fantastic. So how long has that been going? This doctor? You saying you just started this
You
year?
know, yeah, what's wild is I made the announcement May 1st, so a month and a week ago.
Wow.
And I already have 10 students enrolled,
Wow.
and some of them have already started the program. So
Wow.
there's a lot of hunger for it. Just
Mm.
one quick illustration, because of what you said. One of the students is in Canada, and he wants to do a dissertation on obstacles to faith in God, especially people who are doing this deconstructing. So kind
Okay.
of like it's less of a sociological study and more of a conceptual. What do people say? The problem of evil, science or evolution or whatever. I don't know what he's going to go toward, but that's kind of his general
Mm.
project.
Awesome. Hey, if he would find it helpful, get him to get in touch with me as well, because
Okay,
we
yeah.
have this huge, group of people. There's we're working around 400 people right now, but it's growing rapidly. Who are going? We'd love to be studied. We'd love to answer a survey for you. So
Nice.
if it would
Yeah.
help him to have a group of people that he can literally go, oh, here's what 500 people that are deconstructing said.
Yep.
That could be very helpful. So we're wanting to be able to also be open to other people and other candidates. We just had, do you know Michelle Collins at all? I just put
That
her
sounds
podcast out this week.
familiar. Is she a psychology person?
Exactly. She's doing her
Yes.
doctorate. I think her candidacy is in the psychology of grief, of going through
Yes.
deconstruction. And so
I've
fascinating
exchanged
topic.
emails with her, but I don't know her personally. Yeah.
But yeah, so again, like another person that was like, wait, I could ask like 500 people a bunch of questions and I have some clear cut cold data. That's great. And so it's quite exciting to be able to I love data. I don't really ever care about being a doctor or anything. That doesn't really excite me particularly, to be honest with you. But I just love the world. I just love studying and looking at these things. My big concern, when I talked with Jared, my friend that's doing his doctorate at King's College, my problem is, and he says, because he did ministry school with me, he's like, dude, you are never going to be able to get any kind of study. He's like, you can't study one thing for more than a week. He's like, I've never known you to read one book in one day. You've read 3 or 4 books every day I've ever met you. You've just put it down after 10 pages and gone, oh, I want to read about this now. Like, and that's my biggest fear, is like, I don't know if I could.
You just sound like a typical open and relational theologian, Phil.
There we go.
You're
I'm
going
made
all
for it.
kinds of different directions.
I'm made for it. So if people want to go down that line, because you tend not to just pick up a doctoral program straight out of school. So what kind of requirements are people going to potentially need to look at something like that?
Well, most people coming into the program have a master's degree. There are a couple of people who haven't yet finished their master's. And so Northwind Theological Seminary also has master's classes. So some have dual enrolled in my program and to complete their master's. One person doesn't even have a bachelor's done, and so they're not in my program, but they're starting in the process to get to that place where they could enroll.
Yeah. Is there, generally speaking, I'm intrigued by like how people transition from undergraduate to graduate. It's often fascinating to me, like I mentioned, my father-in-law, right? He's got a master's in philosophy. I think his undergraduate was in maths, and then he went to philosophy as a master's. And then as his, postgrad, his doctorate, he does like, astrophysics or something. And I'm like, this guy's bouncing around. And so is there, generally speaking, are most people coming into this program doing their undergrads and their masters within theology, divinity, maybe philosophy, or do people come out of, is that something that people can do? Because I just know we've got a very diverse group of people.
I've got 2 people with no theological degrees. Both of them are psychologists.
Okay.
Who are really interested in theology and psychology. So you don't have to have that kind of background.
Sure.
Some people are pursuing more theoretical projects, more others, one guy wants to do something on discipleship from an open and relational perspective. Another person wants to do a brand new cosmology. So it's highly theoretical. So I'm open to doing lots of different things because my interests are all over the place like yours are.
Sure.
And, I have some background in both the practice and the theoretical.
Yeah.
So we're willing to work with people who may not have all the degrees they would like to have, but, are sharp and have a deep interest in open relational thought.
Awesome. Well, yeah, if people are listening to this, they should definitely check it out for sure.
Definitely. Yeah.
And so I've enjoyed chatting to you for 2 hours. So you're the sort of person I would love to be supervising me for a doctorate.
Thanks, Phil.
Sit down every now and again and go, this is what I'm thinking. What do you think? I feel like we could have some good chats there.
I do too.
I'm jealous. I'm jealous of stuff like that because I'm like, oh, I would love to be supervising 10 different people, all kind of exploring different things and having them come to me going, this is what I'm thinking. Can you read this? What do you think? Oh, I'd love that. It's great.
Yeah,
awesome.
Definitely.
Dude, I've absolutely loved having you on. It's been a
Good.
real pleasure.
Well, I've enjoyed
really
the
enjoyed
conversation
it.
too.
Yeah, I'm sure we can, we'll have you on sometime in the future again and we can talk about, who knows, maybe we can go down some philosophy or,
sounds
like you've got a few different areas you could talk about. We could dive into some of your other 24 books.
There you go. I love it.
That's awesome. Cool.
Sounds good.
Have a good evening. Yeah.
Yeah, you
I
too,
guess it must
Phil.
be evening for you, isn't it? You, Manton?
It's 5 p.m., 5:10 p.m.
You're getting
my
there.
time.
Yeah.
What's your time?
We're 10 past midnight. So.
Oh, wow. All right. Yeah.
I'm going to go chill.
Yeah.
And then,
all
go
right.
to bed. All right. Love you,
See you
Tom.
later,
Have a good
Phil.
one. Yeah. Cheers.
You too. Bye.